Hello everyone and welcome. I am Floyd Richmond from Studio T at Tarleton State University. Today I'm going to give you a tour of Pro Tools, which is the industry standard for audio production in the music business. We will cover basic and advanced concepts. By the end of the session, you should have an in-depth understanding of recording and editing audio using this professional level tool. I'll begin by launching Pro Tools from my application dock. If you're following along and have not yet set up your iLock, pause and follow the instructions on the screen. Pro Tools uses strong copy protection and will not work until your iLock account is in order. In the old days, we had to have a physical iLock device plugged into the USB ports of our computers. But today, you can authorize Pro Tools on individual computers. As it launches, Pro Tools loads the plugins and third-party extensions installed on your computer. It looks for instruments and other resources such as special effects that it can use when editing. If you are new to audio editing, this may be quick. When Pro Tools runs, the dashboard appears. From here, you can create new projects on your local drive, can load recent projects, or you can create and load projects that you have saved in your Avid Cloud account. Let's look at the tabs in the Pro Tools dashboard one by one. If you're going to create a new project, you will give it a name, choose from existing templates, or create your project from scratch. The templates are useful for shared spaces such as labs or a studio where specialized equipment is used or where the same kinds of projects are often recorded. With or without a template, you specify the audio file type to use for the project. Unless you have a reason to use something else, I recommend WAV. You will also specify the sample rate and bit depth for the project. Again, unless you have a reason to use something else, such as an older audio interface, I recommend you go with a sample rate of 48 kHz and a bit depth of 24. You will also notice a pop-up that lets you select input and output options. Unless you've changed your audio setup recently, you'll go with last used. You'll also notice a button that says interleaved. Click to turn it on. This means that your stereo files will be combined into a single file. Although you set it here, you may need to turn this on again when saving audio or bouncing files from Pro Tools. You must also specify where you would like to save this project. For convenience, I save projects on my desktop, but you may reduce clutter by using any folder on your computer. When you hit the Create button, the session will be created. In addition to the Create tab, there is also a Recent tab. Click there to see recently edited projects. The third tab lets you save and load your projects from your Avid Cloud account. This means that you could go to any computer with Pro Tools, log into your Avid account, and have access to your projects. This is a great convenience, especially when compared to copying the files from one machine to another. When Pro Tools saves a project, it creates a folder into which project resources are saved. Many people assume that to share a file, they can just copy the PTX file, but to guarantee success, you must copy the entire folder instead. For now, though, I will begin by opening a recent file and give you a quick tour of a project that I have completed. This is a simple round that I composed in a notation program. On screen, you can see a copy of the music. You'll notice that when you're in Pro Tools, you have two different kinds of tracks. These with the bubbles representing each note are instrument tracks, and these with pictures of the sound waves are digital audio tracks. At the bottom of the screen, you will see that I recorded a round in the piano instrument tracks. You can see each of the three entries of the melody. At the top of the screen, you'll see the three digital audio tracks with vocal recordings also performing the round, but an entry later than the piano tracks. The next digital audio track is a drone track, which is performed with the round. Now that we know how the song is organized, let's listen. In the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there's a transport. I will first press the rewind button and then play.
Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do. So, fa, so, so, fa, fa, so. So, la, do, di, di, la, so. So, fa, mi, mi, re, re, do.
And there you have it. That was a quick and easy project like one you might make for your students in Pro Tools. You can sing and perform yourself, or you can invite your students to perform and record. Before we move on, let's do a brief explanation of the Pro Tools environment. You can see that the edit window contains a list of vocal and instrumental tracks used in the song. You can listen to any single track by turning on its solo button.
Do, re, mi, re, do.
Turning on the solo button of several tracks lets you listen to just those tracks.
Do, re, mi, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, do.
Option-click a solo button to turn off solo for all tracks. Conversely, you can turn off any track by clicking its mute button. This could be especially useful if you're checking to see if a track contributes positively to the recording as a whole.
Do, re, mi, do.
You can also create a better balance between tracks by setting its volume slider. This is more easily done in the mix window. Type Command equal and use the volume slider at the bottom of the screen. Each track also has a pan control. This requires a bit of explanation. When you listen to a live performance, you perceive the location of the various instruments and performers. We may not be as good as bats at this, but when listening, we receive many spatial cues. Electronic instruments often route all sounds to a single speaker, eliminating the spatial information of the original performance. By using Pro Tools panning controls, we can restore many of these spatial cues. This is also easiest to edit in the mix view. Here I can see that track 1 is panned to the left, track 2 to the right, and track 3 is in the middle. This permits me to hear each track as though it is coming from a specific location. This gives the recording a sense of space and an increased measure of realism. So that's a quick overview of opening and playing an existing project in Pro Tools. At this time, let's record this project ourselves. First, though, we'll spend a few minutes making certain that our computer is set up correctly. If you have never recorded with Pro Tools before, you will need to begin by telling the program what microphones and interfaces you have connected to your computer. Go to the Setup menu and choose Hardware Options. Here you will find a button that says Launch Your Setup Application. This will look different on Macintosh and Windows computers, but they will accomplish the same things. The most important thing here is to create a configuration describing your equipment. Later, we'll choose that from within Pro Tools. If you don't have an audio interface, microphones, and special speakers, you can use your computer's built-in microphone and speakers. Some desktops may not have a built-in microphone, but laptops usually do. Of course, for professional results, you will want to record using a good microphone and audio interface. I have a USB microphone plugged in and will use that for recording. On the Macintosh, I create a profile for my microphone, the AT2020, by clicking this plus button. In the audio profile, I tell the computer that I will use my microphone for input, but the built-in audio for the output. Once I have set up this profile, I close the Macintosh Audio MIDI setup utility. Back in Pro Tools, the computer has not switched to the audio setup that I just created. Instead, it is using my previous setup. I will change that in the next option in the Setup menu, but for now, I will dismiss this dialog box by clicking OK. In the Setup menu, the next thing I do is select my playback engine. Instead of using the previous device, I will select my newly created device. Thankfully, you only have to do this once, unless you change the hardware that you're using to record. Pro Tools will tell the computer that it needs to restart. It will save your work automatically and restart with the new sound settings. Click OK to any dialog boxes that show up. The next option in our Setup menu will be Input and Output. This particular screen is primarily confirming that the inputs and outputs are as expected. Also, if desired, you can rename the devices so that they accurately describe the gear that you're using. There are two tabs at the top of the dialog box. The first shows that it is using the AT2020 for input. This, of course, is what we want. To the right, it shows the inputs of this device. The next tab is Output. It shows the main outs have two outputs, left and right stereo channels. To change the names of devices in the Input-Output dialog box, I double-click their titles and rename them. Custom names help me make certain in other parts of the program, especially in the input and output sections of the mix window, that I'm using the gear that I want. Alright, I'll go ahead and tell it OK, and that should be all for the setup. There are a lot of additional options in the setup menu, but most of those are very specialized. You will only occasionally use them. The ones I've shown are the ones that you will use most often. If we press rewind and play, we can make certain that our changes to the setup didn't break anything.
Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do.
I can also test the input by record enabling an audio track and speaking into the microphone. If I see green light dancing on the channel, then I know that input is working properly. All indications are that Pro Tools is operating as it should. To create a new project, go to the File menu and choose New Session. I'll call it PT Demo. I'll use local storage. I will set it up for working with WAV files, 24-bit sample depth, and 48 kHz sample rate. The input-output will be the last used. I'll keep the file type set to interleaved. I'll save to the desktop, and I'll click Create. If I have another project open, Pro Tools will ask if I want to save it. That's usually a good idea. Pro Tools opens to an empty edit window. I'll need some tracks into which to record. From the track menu, I will select Audio Track and indicate that I would like 4 mono tracks. The microphone I'm using only records one channel. If I had 2 microphones plugged in or was using a stereo mic, I could create stereo tracks instead. Since I already know what I will be recording in each of those tracks, I'm going to give each track an appropriate name. You do that by double-clicking the track title. Naming tracks impacts the way that Pro Tools saves session files, and though you could rename them at any time, it's best to give each track a useful name sooner rather than later. If you ever have to dig into the files saved by Pro Tools, you'll be glad that you did. Renaming them immediately after creating the track is best. At the top of the edit window is the Universe window. This is a navigational tool that lets you quickly go to the beginning, end, top, or bottom of your piece. For our short song, it's not that useful, but if you've got a long project, it will be. The Universe window may be turned on and off in the View menu. Choose View, Other Displays, Universe window. Turning it off gives more screen space for editing, especially if you don't need it for a short piece. Anytime students are working with a new piece of music, I instruct them to check the time signature and key signature. In Pro Tools, we'll do the same. The meter ruler is useful for adding time signature changes. Go to the View menu, pull down to Rulers, and select Meter. The project is currently in the default time signature of 4/4, and that is what I want, so I don't have to make any changes. If I did want to make changes, I would click at the point where the time signature should change, usually the start of the piece, click on the plus button on the meter ruler, and select the desired time signature such as 4/4, 3/4, 2/4, 6/8, or whatever is needed. After that, I can leave the meter ruler visible or hide it again using the View menu. For the key signature, we'll do the same. Go to the View menu, pull over to Rulers, and select Key Signatures. The project is currently in C major, the default key, but I will change it to B flat. To do so, I'll rewind so the playhead is at the start of the piece where I want the key signature to change. On the key signature ruler, I'll click the plus button and choose the key signature. There's B flat with 2 flats. One click and I'm good to go. After that, I can leave the key signature ruler visible or hide it again using the View menu. You can use multiple time signatures and key signatures in a piece of music. You just have to position your playhead at the location where the change is desired and click the plus button from the meter or key signature rulers. I will also want to set the tempo for this project. There are several different ways to do this, but the easiest is in the transport window. If the transport window is not visible, you can show it from the window menu, or if you have an extended keyboard with a number pad, you can type Command 1 from the number pad. So in my transport window, I find the tempo quarter note equals field and double click and type the desired tempo in beats per minute. 120 is the default tempo, and that's the tempo that I want to use, so I do not have to make a change for this project. You can also use multiple tempos in a piece of music. To do so, however, you have to show the tempo ruler and enter changes with the plus button as you did using the meter and key signature rulers. In the transport window, I'll turn on the metronome. If I were to record now, however, I would not hear a metronome. For the metronome or a count-off to work, Pro Tools requires that you also create a click track. Go to the track menu and select the last item, Create Click Track. The track is created under the selected track. If this is not already at the bottom of the track list, I'll drag it down so it's out of the way of the other tracks. There is also a button in the transport window that says Count Off. When turned on, Pro Tools will give a 2-bar count off when recording. You can double-click the button and change the setup of the count off if you wish, but I will use the defaults. The transport window frequently gets in the way. I typically move it to the bottom of my screen, or if I have a 2-screen system, I move the transport to the second window. Of course, I can always close it and show it again when needed. This particular window with the tracks is called the Edit window, but there's another view in Pro Tools that is commonly used. In fact, there are 3 windows that are especially important. The first is the Edit window, which you are seeing now. The next is the Mix window, which shows the same tracks but in a vertical setup like that found on a mixing board for live sound. Here you can see tracks 1, 2, 3, and 4. In the Mix window, you have easy access to mixing controls and can turn the volume of each track up or down. You can also set the panning of each track to the left or right, and if you need any special effects on the tracks, then you can add those in the Inserts area. I'll be showing more of that later. For now, I'll switch back to my Edit window. One of the first keyboard shortcuts you will memorize in Pro Tools is Command Equal, which will switch back and forth between the Mix and Edit windows. Again, the 3 windows you will be using most in Pro Tools are the Edit, Mix, and Transport windows. I'm closing my Transport window for convenience now. To record, it's often useful to have some form of scratch track or piano accompaniment in place first. In this section, I'll show recording such tracks using MIDI and alternatively by importing standard MIDI files into Pro Tools. I can create instrument tracks from the track menu in Pro Tools and record the piano accompaniment into them using an attached MIDI keyboard. To record into an instrument track, I turn on Record Enabled on the track and in the transport and press play in the transport. I then play the desired music using an attached MIDI keyboard. You'll see that Pro Tools has recorded notes into my instrument track. There is another important step I'll need to show before we can listen to the recorded data. I'll be doing that in just a moment. Although we had to do a good bit of work to get audio recording set up in Pro Tools, MIDI does not require the same effort. Pro Tools is always monitoring any available MIDI inputs. If it detects that I played MIDI notes during recording into an instrumental track, it saves the notes. There is one important qualification, however. I must plug any MIDI keyboards or devices I wish to use into the computer before launching Pro Tools. Pro Tools scans for MIDI devices to use when it starts up. If it finds them, you're in great shape. If, however, you plugged in a MIDI keyboard after launching Pro Tools, you'll need to save your project and relaunch Pro Tools so it will be aware of your MIDI instrument. Most MIDI keyboards have a USB output that plugs directly into a computer, though other MIDI interfaces may be used for older gear. Again, all MIDI keyboards and or interfaces must be plugged in before launching Pro Tools. You can plug multiple MIDI instruments into Pro Tools, and the program will use any and or all of them for input when recording. For this song, however, I wrote the original round in Finale. From Finale, I can create a standard MIDI file which I can then import into Pro Tools. Let me show that. Here's the round in Finale. From the File menu, I will choose Export Standard MIDI File. I will name this PT Demo and will save it where I can find it. The project folder or my desktop would be good locations. When prompted, I will select a Format 1 MIDI file, which has all staves saved into a separate track. When I switch back to Pro Tools, I go to the File menu and choose Import. The piano accompaniment will come over sounding exactly as it did in the program where it was created. Pro Tools asks if I want to import the tempo map and the key signature from the MIDI file. If I had not set them up earlier in Pro Tools, it would be good to say yes to that prompt. Since I did previously set them, I'll say no. You'll see the newly imported tracks at the bottom of the screen in the Edit window. As before, if the tracks do not come up with descriptive names from the MIDI file, it's a good idea to rename them now by double-clicking on their title. I'll call these tracks Piano 1, 2, and 3. I mentioned before there is an important final step when importing MIDI files or when playing instrument tracks recorded in Pro Tools. Although these tracks were created as instrument tracks, they were not assigned an instrument for playback. Pro Tools has a number of virtual instruments which can be used to play sounds. We will choose the desired instrument in the mix window, type Command equal. From the insert area of the mix window, use the pop-up to select an instrument for each MIDI track. Since I want a piano sound, I'll choose Mini Grand from the instrument section of my plugins. Pro Tools shows a dialog box with timbre and other options for the piano, but I will go with the defaults and close that window. I'll add a Mini Grand for each of these other two tracks, but a shortcut can be used to speed up the process. If I hold the Option key while dragging the first instrument to each of the next tracks, Pro Tools will make a copy. So now I have my instrument tracks prepped and ready. Just a quick note, each version of Pro Tools comes with different instruments. The most common Pro Tools instruments are the Mini Grand, which is very convenient for quickly setting up a piano for playback. Boom, which is a programmable drum machine and is used for popular percussion instruments, and Expand 2, which has a collection of approximately 2,500 quality instrument sounds. More recent instruments include Structure Free, a sampler which can be easily customized, a vacuum tube synthesizer, and a DB33 organ emulator. Some versions of Pro Tools, like Pro Tools First, may not have all of these instruments. We'll look at these instruments in more detail later, but all are installed as indicated, and all have a dialog box where presets and options may be set. To check my instrument tracks, I solo the instrument, press rewind, and then play. Works great. I'm ready to start recording vocals now. In order to do this, I unplug the speaker and plug in a pair of headphones. This way I'll be able to hear the count-off, metronome, and accompaniment while recording, but will be able to record only my voice. My metronome and count-off are on in the transport window. I record enable track 1 and the transport. I rewind to make sure I'm recording from the start, and press play in the transport and begin.
Do, re, mi, re, do, mi, fa, so, fa, fa, mi, so, la, do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do.
When done recording, I press the square stop button from the transport. I have recorded the entire round, but there is some extra data before and after which I will delete. I'll do this using my selection tool from the top of the edit window. I will select the material I don't want and type the backspace delete key. As is frequently the case, there are many ways to do things in Pro Tools. To delete the unwanted portion of the recording at the end, I will choose the Trim tool and adjust the end of the recorded clip so that it only contains the desired audio. The Trim tool remembers the content that was trimmed, so you can use it to restore if you trim too much. Instead of recording the round 3 times, I will copy and paste track 1 into tracks 2 and 3. To do this, I choose the Hand tool, click on the recorded clip, type Command C, and then I set my cursor at the location of the second entrance and select track 2 and paste the recording into that track by typing Command V. I repeat this process for voice 3. In order to make this more like the original, I will also record a drone part. Since track 1 is still record enabled, I will turn that off and will record enable only the drone track. The drone does not start at the beginning of the piece, so I can click at the point where I wish the drone to enter. I may wish to zoom in or out so I can see all the tracks on the screen while recording. I do that with the plus and minus zoom controls in the lower right corner of the edit window. After record enabling the track and transport, I press play in the transport to begin recording. If I'm happy with the recording, I turn off the record enable button for the track, unplug my headphones, and plug the speaker back in. I press play and listen to the arrangement as it stands now.
Do, re, mi, re, do, mi, fa, so, re, do, so, fa, so, re, do, so, fa, so, re, do, so, la, do, re, so, fa, mi, re, do.
And there is our first recording and arrangement in Pro Tools. You'll recall we talked about panning the tracks to provide location data for each performer or track. I'll do that in the mix window. I will pan track 1 to the left and track 2 to the right. I'll put tracks 3 and 4 in the middle. I'll repeat that with the instrumental tracks also. The instrumental tracks are stereo tracks, so I could set both channels to the same location, that is, 2 left, 2 right, and 2 middle. That should work fine for stereo recorded piano instruments, but might not do as well for instruments where the 2 channels are different, as happens often with many electronic instruments. In those cases, I could do some averaging of the settings for the left and right channel to preserve the depth of the stereo recording and to still produce locational cues. That's beyond what I wanted to cover now, but experiment with this further if you wish. When I listen to the pan tracks in stereo headphones or from 2 different speakers, I hear a spatial difference between each of the tracks.
Do, re, mi, re, do, mi, fa, so, re, do, so, fa, so, re, do.
In addition to giving some space between instruments, panning can be used for many special effects, such as having a singer or various instruments move across the stage. Panning is often used in combination with automations where we record changes to the panning controls over time. I'll show you this later in the video. There are some additional things that I did when editing the original to improve this recording. These are slightly advanced techniques, but I'll be showing them to you shortly. Before we do, I would like to show you some additional features of the Pro Tools environment. We've been looking at the selection, trim, and hand tools from the toolbar at the top of the Pro Tools edit window. There is a Smart tool which you select by clicking the border of these 3 tools. When the Smart tool is selected, if you're in the upper portion of a track, Pro Tools goes into selection mode. If you're in the lower portion, you get the hand tool. If you're at the very beginning or end of a track, then you get the trim tool. The Smart tool saves time, but sometimes it's easier to work with just one of the tools. You can choose them individually if needed. The Smart tool works similarly with clips and instrumental and digital audio tracks. There are 2 additional tools beside the Smart tools. The first is the Scrub tool, and when selected, you can move over a track to hear the audio from that track.
Fa, fa, mi, so, fa.
You can scrub forward or backward. This tool is particularly useful for finding locations for edits, such as copy and paste. The second tool is the Pencil tool. It is primarily used for drawing automations and for entering MIDI notes, both of which we'll cover in more detail later. The Smart tools are impacted by the selected edit mode in Pro Tools. Notice that there are 4 edit modes in the top left corner of the edit window: Slip, Shuffle, Grid, and Spot. These are best illustrated by using the hand and selection tools in one of the recorded clips. By the way, if you are uncertain, Slip mode should be the default for most purposes. The tool turns green when it's selected. In the traffic world, green means go, so you can safely use it and the tool will normally perform as expected. Note that in slip mode and using the hand tool that I can slip or slide a clip with no restrictions as to its placement. Also note with the selection tool, if I cut a section from the recording, the selection is removed and surrounding data stays where it is. Again, this is the behavior that is most expected when editing music, and the slip tool is the one that should be most commonly used. I'll put this back like it was using Command-Z, the undo command, and we'll use some of these same operations to illustrate the other modes. Let's look next at grid mode. If you use the grid mode in the hand tool, you can only drag the clip to select locations which align with an imaginary grid. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner of the edit window, there is a grid pop-up which lets you select the values for that grid. Currently the grid is set to 1 bar, and I can only drop the clip at the start of that bar. Using the grid pop-up, I can set the grid to 1 beat, and then I can drop the clip at the start of any beat. If you click the grid mode button in the upper left-hand corner, you'll find that it has a pop-up which lets you select between 2 grid modes. Absolute grid mode is the default, and it operates as explained. The easiest way to understand relative grid mode is to imagine your clip has a pickup note, and dropping the clip onto the start of a bar would displace the pickup. By selecting relative grid mode, you can drag a clip with a pickup, and if the grid is set to the bar, the pickup will not be placed at the beginning of the bar, but at the same relative location to the bar as the original pickup. Most people will use absolute grid mode and may switch to relative grid mode and back after short edits. If you experience unusual grid behavior, check to make sure you are in the desired grid mode. Grid mode will apply to selections copied and pasted using the selection tool also. The third mode is shuffle mode, which works more like cut and paste in a word processor. If you cut and paste a phrase from one part of a sentence to another part, the words move or shuffle to fill the location of the cut, and then shuffle again to make room for the pasted phrase. That is in contrast to the more musical slip mode, where the cut phrase is removed, but the other notes and music stay where they were. From my perspective, shuffle mode makes the most sense when editing a podcast or radio show rather than when editing music, although there are some occasional musical applications. This mode turns red when selected, indicating that you should use the greatest caution. If you don't know what's happening, this tool could cause some significant musical misalignment. So let's take the example of a podcast. If a speaker explains an idea, but it becomes apparent that the idea needed some setup, which was given immediately after, it's easy in shuffle mode to cut the setup, scooting everything afterward into the gap, and to paste it where needed, scooting everything after that to the location needed. Returning to the musical example, shuffle mode could be used for rearranging the form of an entire piece. Let's say you have a piece with A, B, and C sections. And you want it to be A, B, A, C, A. Shuffle mode would be the easiest way to do that. You do have to make sure that you select all tracks before cutting in shuffle mode so that the music does not misalign. Again, shuffle mode is indicated by a red warning signal. Use much caution. The final mode is spot mode. Spot mode turns orange-yellow, which in the traffic world is most often associated with caution. It is for those people who know exactly the spot where they would like a copied selection to be pasted. Pro Tools will ask, where in the track should this be pasted? You enter the bar and beat numbers or any other time scale that Pro Tools understands. This is particularly useful if you have a lot of cuts to do in a long song, know the location in the tracks where the cuts should be pasted, and don't want to scroll through the document to find them. In specific circumstances, this is a useful mode, but it is the least used of Pro Tools editing modes. Again, if you're uncertain, put the computer in slip mode. That will be what most people expect when using the program, and it works well for most musical operations. You'll find zoom controls in Pro Tools in a number of places, but there is a collection of useful tools between the edit modes and the smart tools. This left arrow button is a horizontal zoom button, and when clicked, zooms out so you can see more data on the screen. This tool zooms in the horizontal direction only. If I click on the right arrow, Pro Tools zooms in so that I can see more of the individual notes. The magnifying glass tool accomplishes the same thing. Click it to zoom in, and hold the Option key while clicking it to zoom out. Under these zoom options are presets that were created by Pro Tools. Basically, they guess at what might be useful zoom values, but you can set the presets to values that work for your project by zooming in or out to the desired level and then clicking and holding each preset. As we've seen before, there are also horizontal and vertical zoom controls in the lower right-hand corner of the edit window. There are also some keyboard shortcuts that you might try. Command/ zooms in and out. Command Option Control up or down fits all tracks to the window. The letter E toggles between zooms. Option A and Option F also execute zoom commands. So, returning to our tools, let's take a deeper look at the pencil tool. The pencil tool will be used for a number of different things. One important use is clicking the notes into instrument tracks. If you recorded a track and accidentally left a note out, you can add it. Notice that when we click a note into this instrument track, it changed the edit mode of the track from recorded clips to notes. Now that we're in note mode, we can use the Smart tools to make any number of corrections. Using the Hand tool, we can move wrong notes to the correct pitch or beat. Using the Trim tool, we can make the articulation of a note shorter, more marcato, or longer, more legato. Using the Selection tool, we can select a group of notes and cut, copy, or paste them, or change the pitch, effectively transposing a section. We can also change the rhythm or articulation of all of the selected notes at once. If you compare the instrument track that I'm editing with the other instrument tracks, you see that it's a different color. That's because when I started entering notes into the track, Pro Tools automatically switched that track into note editing mode. I'm going to zoom in vertically so we can see the track header and more about what's happening. Notice this pop-up menu is set to Notes on the track that I'm editing and to Clips on the other instrument tracks. I can switch back and forth using these pop-ups. If while editing a track it behaves unexpectedly, it's good to check that you're in the correct editing mode. When in clip editing mode, I can move the entire bubble that encloses all of these notes. When in note editing mode, I can edit individual notes on the track. The instrument tracks have a set of pop-ups that are relevant for instrumental tracks. You will primarily use notes or clips, but you might want to edit the velocity or other aspects of the notes. If I choose velocity, I can drag my pencil tool and set a custom velocity for each note. If I click and hold the pencil tool, it reveals a number of different pencil operations. The basic pencil tool lets me draw freestyle. The line tool lets me easily execute, for example, a linear crescendo. There are tremendous editing capabilities in Pro Tools. I put everything back as it was with Command Z and put the track back in clip editing mode. Again, if you're trying to edit and Pro Tools is not doing what you expect, one of the first things you should do is check if you're in the appropriate editing mode. We looked at some of the editing modes in the pop-ups of instrumental tracks. You can explore these other modes as your time permits. Digital audio tracks have a different set of pop-ups. Let's have a look at how we can automate our volume controls in Pro Tools for a more musical effect. Let's look at the first vocal track. In my opinion, the volume should be loud at the entrance of the round of each voice. As each subsequent voice enters, the first track should get softer so the other voice can be easily heard. Also, at the end of the round, the music should fade away, so the voices should continue to get softer with each phrase until the round ends with only one voice singing. The first step in entering these volume adjustments is set the track into volume editing mode. Notice that other modes include panning, among others, but if you understand entering volume automations, you'll be able to do the rest. The next step is to click in insertion points where each volume change will occur. I just click with the pencil tool to create two insertion points or little dots at the end of each phrase. The first is for the ending volume of the previous phrase, and the second is for the starting volume of the upcoming phrase. Once the dots are entered, I will take the hand tool and turn down each phrase 2 or 3 decibels. This seems like a lot of work, but you only have to do it occasionally. Once all of these automations are entered, you can take your selection tool and copy and paste them to the other tracks. I select the automations and choose Copy. I switch each additional track to volume mode, click where I want the automations to appear, and choose Paste. These volume adjustments will be performed by each voice, and hopefully it will improve the mix. Let's play and listen.
Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, fa, so, so, fa, so.
Let's look at that also in the mix window. I type Command equal to see the mix window.
Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, fa, so, so, fa, so. So, la, do, do, ti, la, so. So, fa, mi, re, re, do.
You can see why these are called automations. Pro Tools is automatically executing the volume changes entered. The musical result is a much better balance. Many people will not take the time to edit on this level, but Pro Tools gives you the ability. As always, there are multiple ways of doing things, and besides additional automation techniques which we'll learn later, often the best approach is to have the performers sing the dynamics correctly when recording. If they don't, however, Pro Tools gives you options for correcting it. When finished with volume editing, I set my digital audio track back to waveform editing so it will perform as expected with future edits. Let's see yet another feature of Pro Tools. Sometimes you will find that you only want to work with select tracks. The audio tracks are the first 4, and the instrument tracks are the next 3. Together, they fill the Pro Tools screen. By the time you zoom out enough so that you can see all tracks, the controls are quite small. On the left-hand side of Pro Tools, you will find a track list. At the top of the track list is a pop-up that lets me choose which tracks I would like to view. I can choose instrumental tracks or audio tracks or all tracks. Additionally, when each track is visible, it has a small dot beside its name, and when hidden, the dot disappears. You can click those dots or spaces where they go to hide and show individual tracks. When done, you can show all tracks again. Pro Tools has a feature for creating track groups. This is useful, for example, when you wish to adjust the volume of a group of tracks at the same time. You create and work with groups in the group list on the left-hand side of Pro Tools. To create a group of tracks, I select their titles in the list of the Edit or Mix windows. I do this by clicking on the title of the first track, then shift-clicking on the title of each additional track to be added to the group. I'll choose Group Now from the group list. Pro Tools will ask for a name, and these are vocals, so that will make a fine title. With the vocal group selected, I can switch over to the mix view. Now when I drag the volume slider of any one in the group, all sliders move together. This is much easier than moving individual sliders. There is a default group entitled All Tracks. When I choose it, I can move all sliders together. When I turn off groups, the sliders move individually. Notice that the group selection is primarily for selecting groups of tracks and adjusting their controls together. I'll turn my groups off to resume normal editing. Pro Tools also maintains a list of all the audio clips that I record and or edit while using the program. I can click on any audio clip in my tracks and the corresponding clip in the clip list will highlight. There are several uses for the clip list. First, if I need to make a copy of a given clip, I could copy and paste it, but another alternative is just to drag the clip from the clip list into a track. Here, I've created a round more quickly than I could have by copying and pasting. Pro Tools also keeps a copy of each original clip and each edited clip that I make. This is especially useful if I wish to undo something without going through the sequential undo process of the program. Often you remember you want to undo something, but it happened too long ago to undo all the useful edits that you completed in the meantime. With the clip list, you can find your original unedited clip and drag it back into a track, skipping over that undo sequence. Of course, all of these edits are for illustration. I will delete them, but this does show how the Pro Tools clip list works. I am not always using my track and group list. The same is true of the clip list. These can be hidden in the View menu to give more space for editing if desired. Okay, let's review a bit. Left to right again, these are the various modes that Pro Tools will use for editing. These are the zoom controls, including your presets and your horizontal zooming tools. Beneath the zoom tools are mode buttons that impact the way that Pro Tools operate. These are more advanced, and we'll look at them later. In the meantime, you can hover over them, and Pro Tools will tell you the name of each. This area is your counter area, and it tells you where the playhead is. Currently, it's at measure 1, beat 1. If I press play, the counter will update. If I stop and make a selection, you can see the starting and ending points. This is useful for precision edits, although most people will just use their ears and the scrub tool to locate precise edit points. In this field and the one beside it, there are other controls that you can turn on and off as needed. The most used option may be your grid setting. To the right of the grid is a permanently placed transport. This is similar to the transport window, but there's usually not enough space to show all of the transport options in the edit window. The play, record, and rewind buttons, however, provide the most used functions. At this point, I'd like to show you how to add special effects such as equalization, reverb, and compression to each recorded track. I'll type Command equal to view the mix window. You will see that audio tracks are organized vertically into channel strips as they would be in a mixer and live sound. Audio flows from the top to the bottom of the channel strip. On channel 1, you'll notice I have no inserts, and the only two controls which will impact the sound are the panning knobs and the volume slider. You will also see mute and solo buttons, but they're off. You'll also notice there is an input and an output selection for each track. Normally these set up properly themselves, but if you have a complex setup with multiple interfaces, you may find it useful to select between multiple inputs and outputs here. If you have trouble with playback or recording, this is one of the places where you want to check that your settings are okay. Equalization is the first effect that we will examine. Equalization is simply the turning up or down of the bass, treble, or mid-level frequencies of a track. Equalizers permit various levels of editing of these frequencies, but we'll look at a basic 7-band equalizer, which will illustrate the principles for both simpler and more complex equalization tools. I will scroll to the top of the mix window, click on the first insert, and navigate through the pop-up to EQ, and then to the 7-band equalizer. This brings up my EQ editor. If necessary, I turn on the Analyze button so I can see the frequencies which are being used on that track. If I take my bass filter and turn it up, this would produce a bass boost effect.
Do, re, mi, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, do.
You have to listen to the audio in each track to see what equalization is needed. The bands in this range would impact vocals and other instruments in their range. In this range, you would be able to impact the higher instruments such as flute and piccolo. In this range, you can color the sound by brightening or darkening the overtones. One of the things that you might want to do is grab one of these bands, turn it up while running the frequency through the entire scale. If you hear good sounds in one range, you may want to turn those up. If you hear bad sounds in another range, you may want to turn those down.
Do, re, mi, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, do.
I find frequently when recording trombones that I turn higher frequencies down to darken and improve their tone. With tubas, I seldom ever turn the lower frequencies up. Flutes, on the other hand, never play frequencies below middle C, 261.63 Hz. If I turned up the bass boost on the flutes below 261 Hz, I would only be amplifying room noise that may have made it into the recording. Turning that range down may actually reduce room noise in a flute recording. You would not want to suppress notes over 262 Hz in the flute part though, since that could impact notes the instrument was trying to play. Piano has the largest frequency range of any instrument. Its lowest note is 27.5 Hz, which is near the lower limit of human hearing, which is generally thought to be about 20 Hz. The highest note on an 88-note piano is approximately 4,186 Hz. Midi defines notes that go up to about 8 kHz, but that's an effective limit for musical use. Notes over that range are generally irritating and don't sound musical. That's roughly half the range of human hearing of about 20 kHz. We can adjust the EQ of sounds between 8 kHz and 20 kHz again to brighten or darken the overtones of the sounds we've recorded. You'll notice on this 7-band equalizer, the lower and higher frequencies use low and high cut filters. The other filters are bandpass and limiting filters. The process of equalization is filtering frequencies, and you can often improve the sound of vocals, guitars, and other instruments significantly by adjusting their EQ. Again, listening carefully to each recorded sound will provide you with the information needed to make the best improvements. You will notice that as I move the graphic EQ controls, that the values of the knobs change. You can of course only use the knobs if you wish, but I prefer the graphic editing mode. When adjusting EQ, you never want to turn a specific frequency all the way up. Usually 3 decibel changes produce a perceptible change. If you had to turn something all the way up, there was something the matter with the way it was recorded. One other quick note, a strategy that is often used in creating an EQ mix is to carve out frequencies for each individual instrument so they're not conflicting with each other. If you do this, often if you listen to a soloed track, they may sound thin, but when played in combination, they have a fullness and a clarity that is hard to match. There are some tracks, like the lead vocal, however, which you probably don't want to make too thin. Ultimately, your ear will tell you what EQ produces the best result. Another enhancement, which is almost always used, is reverb. There are a number of different reverbs available in Pro Tools, but I will choose the Pro Tools Deverb unit. One of the things that I will draw your attention to is that you have multiple presets from which you can choose. Most of the time you can find a nice reverb option among the presets.
Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, mi, re, re, do.
Of course, you can always experiment with the controls in the reverb unit. Typical reverb controls include the delay setting, how long before the reverb starts, thickness of the echoes, how many instances of the echo there are, and the decay settings, how quickly the echoes die away. Often, reverb settings are modeled after rooms and other forms of producing reverb, such as using plates or springs, and if so, you can often adjust settings for those parameters. Experiment by turning the knobs all the way up or down before returning them to their original settings to see if you hear something that you would like to do. Extreme settings in reverb are often off-putting. One last note, often with reverb you can choose an amount of wet or dry signal. The dry signal has no reverb applied. The wet signal has only the reverb echoes. Mixing these sounds in various combinations produce good results. Although generalizations are hard to make with any audio settings, I often find that 60 to 75% of the dry signal and 25 to 40% of wet signal give a good mix. Don't use this as a formula though, trust your ears. Once you have a reverb setting you like, you can quickly duplicate that reverb unit on other tracks by option dragging the insert onto additional tracks. Again, the contents of the track may mean that you should use a different reverb on those individual tracks. Some reverb units let you set the EQ of the reverb response, and if so, you will find that that is often a useful control. By the way, what I'm showing you is an inefficient method for using reverb as far as your computer's CPU is concerned. Because I copied each of these effects to each individual channel, the computer has to process all that reverb in real time. EQ is almost always done on the individual tracks, but reverb is often added in another manner, which would be creating an aux track, adding a reverb insert on it, and then busing all sounds which should have reverb to the aux track. Even so, I'm sure my CPU can keep up with this particular task. Let's listen to these tracks with reverb.
Do, re, mi, re, do, do, re, mi, re, do, do, re, mi, re, do.
So, if I didn't like the cumulative effect of that reverb, I would have to go back to each track to make adjustments. That's another reason to consider creating an aux track to handle the reverb. While Pro Tools has a host of additional effects, compression in particular deserves attention. Compression is a dynamic process whereby sounds that are too loud for the recording can be reduced and the remainder of the track can be made louder. In popular music, a lead track that you can't hear over the others without turning them too low would benefit from compression. Even if loudness is not your goal, the compressor can still provide benefits. For example, sometimes microphones don't record dynamics well, or sometimes performers make dynamic mistakes like blurting out notes. While you could go in and individually adjust the volume for each note through automations, often the faster solution is to use a compressor. I'm going to add a compressor to the inserts for this track. I will select Dynamics and choose the Dynamic 3 compressor limiter unit. The compressor typically has 4 especially useful settings. Threshold is the dynamic level where the sound begins to be turned down. Monitor the sound, and when you see and hear sound starting to get too loud, set the threshold to that.
Do, re, mi, re, do, mi, fa, so, fa, fa, mi. Do, re, mi, re, do, mi, fa, so, fa, fa, mi.
Ratio is how much the signal is turned down. Start with a ratio of 2:1 or 3:1 and go up or down from there. For especially loud sounds, you may have to go with a larger number, such as 5:1 or 10:1. Attack is how quickly the compression is applied. It is usually measured in milliseconds. Release is how quickly the compression stops after the levels fall below the threshold. It is also usually measured in milliseconds. Compressors also frequently have a knee control, which determines how smoothly compression is applied to the sound over the threshold, and a gain control that lets you turn the final signal up or down. A couple of other things about compressors. If you use them poorly, they could potentially muffle the sound. It's a good idea to turn them off and on to compare with the original sounds. Often, in solving one dynamic problem, you create others. There are no universal settings for compressors, but like EQ, the proper setting will depend on the sound in that track. Also, like EQ, compressors are usually assigned to individual tracks as needed, although it's also common to assign EQ and compression to the master output tracks as well. One last thing about compressors. You can experiment with the location of the compressor in a channel. Often when the signal is too hot coming in, compression is applied before other effects. Often if a signal is amplified in reverb or EQ, compression is applied after those effects. I've seen some people use multiple compressors to try to solve problems with the sound. If you're having to do too much work to fix a sound, re-recording it with a better microphone or with a more narrow dynamic range may be the best option. Above all, work for clarity of the lead vocal. Compression units provide level monitoring and typically show the input or level of the incoming sound, reduction or how often and how much the sound is being turned down, and output or the level of the output signal. You'll notice the output is louder than the input because the gain is turned up by 7 decibels. Now, some people are asking, why wouldn't you leave dynamics to the musicians? There are 2 reasons. First, and most importantly, microphones frequently don't give you a true picture of the sound. Often the editor can make the sound more natural by adjusting the compression. Second, sometimes musicians don't perform the dynamics as clearly and as accurately as they wished. Sometimes they blurt out notes. Compression gives you the opportunity to correct the loudest errors without having to do a lot of individual editing. One advanced compression technique, which I'm only going to mention, is sidechain compression. In this technique, a compressor is typically loaded onto a bass track, and a signal from the kick drum track is routed into the sidechain input of that compressor. Every time the kick drum hits, the bass is compressed so that the kick drum is not drowned out by competing low frequencies from the bass. You can do this with any two instruments where there is a danger that one may drown the other out, but this combination of bass and kick drum is by far the most common use of sidechain compression. Not all compressors have a sidechain input, so to use this you'll have to select one that does. Okay, that gives you a general idea of the primary effects that you would want to use in a typical project in Pro Tools. Let's take a look at some of the Pro Tools menus. The Pro Tools menu is the location of the Pro Tools preferences. This may be different on Windows. Here you can set the preferences for the way that you want the program to operate. The File menu is for opening and creating new projects and saving and duplicating files. Most importantly, however, is where you will come to save the output of your final project so you can share it with others. This operation is called bouncing to disk. Pro Tools only bounces the audio that is unmuted and is selected. The first step is to set the mute and solo buttons so that the tracks you wish to include in the final mix will sound if you press play. The next step is to select all tracks to be bounced to disk. Pro Tools will only bounce unmuted and selected tracks. The second step is to go to the File menu and select Bounce to Disk. A dialog box will appear. You will set your options to indicate that the main outputs are to be bounced. That will always be the case unless you have a reason to choose something else. The next option will be to set the file format for the bounced file. This would be MP3 if you plan to email the file, or WAV if you are using this for a higher quality purpose, such as adding a sound to a video. You can choose both WAV and MP3 if you wish. The stereo format should always be interleaved, which combines the left and right stereo channels into one file. If you are sending this to students, that is what they will expect. As before, for your bounce, the sample rate will be 48 kHz and the bit depth will be 24. These are standard high-quality formats and will record accurately anything that humans can hear without filling up your hard drive. The next step is to give your bounce a name. The bounced file will be saved in the bounce folder of the project that you created. There is an online and offline bouncing option. In years past, online bouncing was the only option. Today, offline bouncing is faster. The only time you would use online or real-time bouncing today is if you are using external hardware, such as a Midi keyboard. You will also be asked for the settings for the MP3 if selected. I suggest going with the highest quality encoding and bit rates if you have plenty of space, but anything over 128 is useful, especially if you have to email your files. YouTube and Facebook have made 128 a standard for everyday streaming. If you choose a bit rate less than 128, especially anything around or less than 96 or 80, you will notice a perceptible decline in the quality. After making your choices, click the OK button. The bounce file is now written to our Pro Tools demo folder in the bounce files folder. I can listen to the WAV or MP3 and will notice very little difference.
So for me, re, re, do. Do, re, mi, re, re, do. Do, fa, so, re, re, do. Do, fa, so, re, re, do. so fa so si re re do, so la do di re re do, so fa mi re re do.
As for the other menus, the Edit menu has the typical cut, copy, and paste options, as well as a number of specialized tools. If you are looking for something that should be on screen but is not, check the View menu to see if it can be turned on or off. Most of the installations of Pro Tools in our studio and lab default to something like what you're seeing on the screen, but you will sometimes find that someone has turned on or off something that should normally be visible. I won't have time to tell you everything that's in the View menu, but the meter ruler is handy for adding time signature changes at any point. The key signature ruler lets you change keys at any point. The best process is often to show these rulers, use them, then hide them so you have more room for editing. The View menu, among other things, also lets you show and hide your universe window, your track list, and your clip list. The Track menu is primarily used for creating new tracks. You can create different kinds of tracks, such as audio and instrument tracks, which we discussed earlier, and those are the two most commonly used. Aux tracks would be creating reverb or other special effects. The Master Fader track is to control everything going out. VCA tracks let you easily group and control the volume level of other tracks. The Midi track is an instrument track, but instead of using a virtual instrument built into Pro Tools, it sends data out the Midi port to an external keyboard. The keyboard creates its sounds outside of Pro Tools, so that the sounds from that device must be routed back into Pro Tools. This is done by routing the audio outputs of the keyboard into the audio inputs of additional digital audio tracks within Pro Tools. You would normally only use MIDI tracks if you have a unique sound on a keyboard or other hardware that cannot be produced with Pro Tools virtual instruments. Using external hardware, you can sometimes create sounds and effects that you could not produce otherwise. So those are the track types that are used in Pro Tools. I would just mention though that the Create Click Track option, which is the bottom option in the track menu, is also very useful. The Clip menu contains a number of options for editing clips. Among them are options such as Rename, Quantize, and Group. Clip names represent each sound on a track, and though clip names are often based on track names, they are different. Clip names are found at the start of each clip, and track names are found in the Edit and Mix windows and in the track list. Quantizing or automatic rhythmic correction in the clip menu is done according to the grid settings and is fast and convenient. It works with either instrument or digital audio, although there is some preparation that you'll have to do before quantizing digital audio tracks. I'll show the specifics on that when talking about the Events menu. Grouping tracks in the clip menu is done when you have a number of short clips that you want Pro Tools to treat as one. Select the clips that you would like to group together, then choose Group from the clip menu. You can then cut, copy, paste, move, and edit the group as though it were a single clip. If needed, you can ungroup the clips in the clip menu also. The Event menu, like many others in Pro Tools, contains many options, but we'll only have time to look at the most important. Foremost among those in the Event menu is quantizing. Quantizing is an operation by which rhythmic errors in a track are automatically corrected. The first step is to select an instrument clip with notes. By choosing Clip, Event Operations, Quantize, I can set the options so that the rhythms are corrected as I specify. If I tell Pro Tools to quantize to the nearest quarter note, all the notes will snap to the closest beat. You can see the notes jump when I click Apply. Since this track has eighth notes, that would be a poor choice. I will undo that and quantize to eighth notes. Now all the notes jump to the nearest half beat. Quantizing tends to make the music sound stiff or square, but it would still be a good idea if the eighth notes were badly played and needed to be corrected. Quantizing is not just for instrumental tracks as it was in the early days. We can quantize digital audio tracks. Step 1 will be to switch the Elastic Audio plugin selector to monophonic. Monophonic would be appropriate for solo instruments such as vocals and bass guitar. Polyphonic would be appropriate for harmonic instruments such as rhythm guitar and keyboards. Rhythmic would be appropriate for drum set. Step 2 will be to select a track and switch it to analysis mode. The computer analyzes each attack of each note. Once all that work is done, the quantize window will work on that digital audio track. Now that moved a lot of things around, and I'm not sure that was what I wanted. I'm going to undo that and adjust just a few notes manually. I am now putting this track into warp mode. Once I find a note that needs to be adjusted, I double-click to create a warp marker on the left and double-click to create a warp marker on the right, and then I double-click to create a warp marker for the note I would like to move. Then I drag the warp marker for that note. This lets me do a more controlled manual quantize and will generally create better results. Oh, when dragging those warp markers, make sure that you have the drag icon visible before you start dragging. Otherwise, you could be dragging the entire clip. Quantize is not useful for every single note, but if you have a phrase or a few notes that you know are off, it can work well for short sections. The next menu is the Audio Suite menu. In the Audio Suite menu, you'll find all the special effects that will normally be added as inserts in the mix track. These include reverb, EQ, compression, and many of the others which we have seen already. The difference is that processes in the Audio Suite are rendered to the tracks instead of being processed by the computer's CPU during playback. The advantage of this is it can significantly reduce the CPU load for Pro Tools during playback. The disadvantage is it's a lot harder to tweak or change tracks that have already been rendered. The Options menu has operational modes that can be toggled on or off in Pro Tools. Among the most useful of these are whether the computer should or should not scroll during playback, and if it does, whether the scrolling should be continuous or screen by screen. Another useful option is the Tab to Transients option. Normally, if you have a clip selected, pressing the Tab key advances to the next clip. If you turn on Tab to Transients in the option window or on the switch above the Edit menu, then Pro Tools advances to the next transient when you press the Tab key. A transient is the location of a new pitch or rhythm and can be useful for editing. We saw the Setup menu earlier. It's primarily for use when starting to use Pro Tools or when the hardware has changed. The Window menu is for showing things that reside in their own window. These include the Edit window, Mix window, Transport window, as well as MIDI editor, Score editor, Event list, and several other specialized Pro Tools windows. The Marketplace menu is where you will sign into your Avid account, connect with the Avid artist community, and there you can hire musicians and producers for your projects or offer your services for hire. You can also find additional plugins and third-party resources and connect with the Avid Online Support Center. The Help menu connects you to the online documentation. Here you'll find a reference guide, a list of shortcuts, connections to online forums and knowledge bases, and other forms of help. So Pro Tools is a professional level digital audio workstation. We often call it a DAW. And while we have hit the most important highlights, there is so much more. We've put in a good bit of time today, so we're going to wind down at this point. But so you're aware, future videos will go into more depth on using instruments, other automation strategies which use the read, write, latch, touch, and off pop-ups, automating controls on Pro Tools effects such as EQ and reverb, creating aux tracks for EQ and reverb, the process of mastering, more about the many special effects possible in Pro Tools, and more about the menu options that we could not get to today. So again, that's going to be everything for today. Thank you for joining us in our review of Pro Tools. I hope that you found something useful. So long, everyone, from Studio T at Tarleton State University. I'm Floyd Richmond, and it's been great to spend some time with you today. Please leave questions in the comments below. Thank you.